Hello. I thought we could do a little recap on what we've been doing for the last couple of weeks just before the Easter holidays. Because we're coming to the end of this topic, and at some point this week, I'll ask you to start thinking about doing an essay on Prime Minister's power. So this seems as good a time as any. We'll try and make it short and sweet and do the things that you needed to do. So the first thing that you'll need to know about this, and what I should have said is, this is a good idea to just have a notepad and paper. I think we'll probably aim for about 15 minutes or so with this. You can stop it and pause it as you go along, obviously. And I've grouped it around a series of questions or a series of statements about prime ministers. Like this one. So why are prime ministers powerful? And one of the most obvious things is because they've got a whole series of things that come with the job. They have some resources or some roles and responsibilities which are part and parcel of being the first primus inter pares, the first among equals. So a little recap on what those are. I could leave it blank and you could guess what they are for the minute and see how many you could guess, but just as soon as we're pushed for time, I'll roll through them for you. So patronage, hiring and firing, appointing ministers to a new cabinet, but also the business of reshuffle. And of course, this means that prime ministers can displace people who have been disloyal, or they can promote people who they want to put into the backbench. They want to put into cabinet from the backbenches, and that's a really useful thing for them to control the party. Chairing cabinet meetings and creating cabinet committees and chairing cabinet committees. We've seen some evidence of that in the current crisis. Also seen some evidence of prime ministers not appearing at cabinet committees as well. But in this case, it means that most of the work of cabinet, if you remember the work we've done on cabinet system, happens not in the cabinet itself. It happens in cabinet committees. And those cabinet committees then normally report to cabinet and effectively deliver policy to the cabinet as well. So this is a really important power that prime ministers have. Negotiating with other countries and negotiating deals to create new treaties or perhaps new trade arrangements. And this is really about the prime minister's power as the national leader, that effectively the person who represents UK government ultimately is one person, and that's the prime minister, and therefore speaks for the government. And leading the party in the Commons. And of course, if a prime minister has a majority, then leading the party in the Commons means effectively delivering, deciding what legislation gets passed in the Commons because of the principle of parliamentary sovereignty. And then creating the structure of executive government itself. So as well as being a leader in the Commons of the legislative branch, the Prime Minister being the leader of the executive means that they're effectively deciding which government departments should exist, what those government departments do, what those civil servants who are leading those departments or delivering policy within those departments should be doing. And Prime Ministers can do things like merge departments together, or they can split departments. So famously, Tony Blair split the Department of Business and Transport, which was being run by John Prescott at the time. And that can be a way of effectively delivering policy more effectively, or downgrading and demoting particular ministers. Okay, so pause for a moment. So some prime ministers are more powerful than others. And just because you get to be prime minister and you have a series of powers and responsibilities and roles that you perform, as we've seen, doesn't mean that all prime ministers can be as powerful as others. We get some very weak ones and some very strong ones. So when we thought about this in lessons, then we have a play with this, a series of cards. We move them around on tables. And what most of you recognized was that really the most important one was this one. It was to do with electoral success. And it was to do with the fact that prime ministers who were really capable, prime ministers who were really able to deliver the policy which they've created for their own agenda, are ones which have had a stonking election victory. They've normally created a big majority, and that's created a series of other things for them. So these other things which are going on are all still very important, but the most successful prime ministers, thinking about Blair and Thatcher, have been the ones who've had electoral success, which is then repeated and recreated electoral success. And you might remember that we created with it on the board something that looks a bit like this, a virtual circle of prime minister's power. So we started with a big majority. Think about Thatcher, winning with a decent-sized majority, Blair winning with a huge landslide majority in 1997. And who knows, we might even consider in December 2019, it looked likely that Boris Johnson's big majority would lead him into this kind of virtual circle. So within that, what we get is, if you win a big majority, then you effectively get control of the parliamentary party. And you get control of the party because there's much less likelihood for backbench rebellions. And that means that you've got a united party which is capable of winning all the votes in Parliament, which means that every piece of legislation you suggest as Prime Minister, which is delivered by Cabinet to Parliament, is then passed. What that means, of course, is you actually get to deliver your manifesto promises. So you don't look like someone who's failed to deliver or has promised much in the election and then come up short. Instead, you look as though you had a plan, you delivered that plan, you delivered the thing that people voted for. And of course, that has its own effect, which means that you get public support, you get high standing in opinion polls, public support from the media, or at least you're less likely to be challenged and bullied by the media as weak prime ministers are. And that then also leads in turn to the fact that MPs in your own party actually think of you as being somebody who's an election winner, somebody who's not a liability, but actually an asset. And therefore they're more likely to be in your sport, even if they don't like you, even if they come from a different faction. They recognise that you're one of the reasons why they're going to keep getting re-elected. And that's why they support you in Parliament. That's why you're less likely to face backbench rebellions or attempted coups or factions. And of course that has its own impact because a united party which goes to the public is one which has more likelihood of electoral success. And if you have more likelihood of electoral success, it's likely that you're going to create a big majority again. So when we think about people like Blair and Thatcher, the reason why they were so successful is because this circle applied to them not once, but twice or 3 times, so that they were able to create big electoral success, big majorities, and then carry on delivering the programme. Okay, so those are reasons why prime ministers can be powerful, the reasons why some prime ministers are more powerful than others. But when we think about this topic, we're also thinking about the idea that not all prime ministers, or rather that some people think that all prime ministers have become more powerful. In other words, it's not that it's Blair or Thatcher or somebody else, but that it's the office of prime minister that's become more powerful, and some things have made the office of prime minister more powerful. So we can try and explain this by looking at these different models of executive power. Now, there's a lot in here. I think sometimes we could probably spend 20 or 30 minutes in a lesson talking about these. But the way to look at them, I think, is to see them historically. So for most of the 19th century, when we thought about what government did, what executive government did, it wasn't really that there was one national leader who was the most important character. Even if we think about Disraeli and Gladstone and so on, we were thinking about cabinet government in which a prime minister was just that primus inter pares, that is, first among equals. They were just effectively the chair of a committee, and it was the committee that was running the rest of government. So foreign secretaries at this time were really important. Palmerston in the 19th century was the person who effectively decided what foreign policy was for government, even though he wasn't the prime minister at the time. That means that prime ministers are relatively weak compared to cabinet government. And of course, what we saw later on in the 20th century is a move towards prime ministerial government. And that prime ministerial government really after the Second World War, especially, and under prime ministers like Wilson, appearing that the prime minister becomes the undisputed leader. In the 1960s, when Wilson was elected, he was elected twice as prime minister, then one of the things that he recognised was that he thought he was the weakest person, having taken control of the government after Conservatives had been in for 13 years. He thought that the civil service was against him, that other ministers had more power than him because they had an army of statisticians and whole departments to support them, and he was the only person who didn't have a department of his own. So he's the one who sets about creating a Downing Street policy unit and an army of civil servants and special advisors whose job is just to work for him. And we see that again with other prime ministers, particularly with Thatcher and with Blair as well, where they develop an inner team of special advisors, special political advisors. And so in particular, when we think about the first Blair administration, it was Alastair Campbell, but it was also Peter Mandelson before he became an MP as well. And people who were really important in deciding that they're the ones who are going to deliver government policy, and ministers are going to follow what they say. Okay. Let's stop for a little cough then. Okay. So, with Blair and Thatcher, though, in some cases, because of national crises that occurred or because of just their domineering personalities that they were, there was an argument from some people that instead of it being a prime ministerial form of government, in fact, we'd moved to a presidential form of government. In other words, that prime ministers had become so important that they acted as if they were a bit like US presidents themselves. They appeared to be above politics. And this is why we use this phrase, spatial leadership. The idea of spatial leadership being that whilst there might be arguments and debate in Parliament itself, when a Prime Minister spoke, a Prime Minister appeared to be speaking above party division because they were helping the country deal with a national crisis or a national moment. And if you think about the Falklands War in 1983, this is Thatcher's presidential moment. The miners' strike is another presidential moment for her as well. And for Blair, it comes in two forms. One is when Princess Diana dies, and very famously he becomes the person who says she was the people's princess, and he appears to be kind of giving emotion for a whole country. And then very shortly afterwards, 9/11 is the thing which has Blair standing on an international stage increasingly, and then working, standing shoulder to shoulder with America, and deciding that that's his main role, is to be the chief executive who is also the commander-in-chief of Britain's forces and somebody who's taking Britain to war. There are some other things that are going on here as well. This presidential thing is because of the increased resources that have been created in a Prime Minister's office, and this reaches its real peak under Blair as well. So as well as Mandelson and Campbell, we also get people like Jonathan Powell, and they become such important closed circle that effectively policy is delivered to cabinet. And this is the thing about presidential government. It appears, sometimes under Thatcher, but especially under Blair, that in fact cabinet is redundant, and even Parliament might be redundant. And Blair was in the habit of releasing government policy in prime ministerial press conferences through Alastair Campbell and other people, rather than delivering policy to Parliament as had been expected in the convention. All of that seems to be a historical thing then. So from the 19th century into the late 20th century, so it reaches its zenith in the beginning of the 21st century with presidential government under Blair. And then, of course, after 2010, the wheels come off this theory. So it seemed to be a really good idea until Gordon Brown, but then especially under Cameron and then successive prime ministers afterwards, because those prime ministers have been relatively weak. And it's made people return to the idea that actually there is a balance of power when it comes to the executive. That within the executive, prime ministers can't dominate it. Instead, they have to depend upon ministers. And sometimes those ministers are more important than they are, or at least appear to have more strength than they do. So Boris Johnson's a really good example of the way in which he challenged both Cameron and May. And also that prime ministers can only get done what civil servants and civil servant departments will allow them to do as well. And that means that those civil service departments can often put a bit of a check on what prime ministers are capable of delivering. And perhaps we're even seeing that now under COVID, but we especially saw that under May and her inability to be able to deliver an EU deal or an arrangement for an EU deal, which all government departments could sign up to. Okay. So we have some strengths and weaknesses of different prime ministers and powers. We have the idea that there are different theories of prime ministerial power. There's also the idea that not all prime ministers are the same. So we return to this one again and take the point off. We've got this idea we've talked about of preeminent prime ministers and predominant prime ministers. And this is from a political scientist called Richard Heffernan. And Heffernan's idea here is that when we look at people like Thatcher and Blair, what is it that makes them so strong? It isn't just that they were the people who were in charge of government. It isn't just that they had these institutional resources. All prime ministers have those. That's why all prime ministers appear, even now, to be more important than their cabinet, more important than other people. But some prime ministers have these personal and political resources. The flip side of this is, of course, that some prime ministers don't have these personal and political resources, and that's what makes them not just not predominant, it's one of the things that makes them fatally flawed and weak. So when we think about leadership ability, for example, the ability of a Prime Minister like Blair to not only lead his own parliamentary party, but to lead the membership of his party in supporting him and to appear to have their respect and support when it came to going out into different elections and appearing to campaign for him and not necessarily challenge him as well. That was a really important thing. And of course, Thatcher had that too. If you contrast that with Jeremy Corbyn, then some people would argue that Corbyn's leadership ability was lacking, and that was the thing. It wasn't necessarily his ideas or his personality or character. It was the fact that he wasn't capable of leading his own party, which then led people in his own party to challenge him as well. So success in office is another feature, which of course comes from the fact that you have had electoral success. We've got that one underneath there. These two are linked. If you have electoral success, it allows you to deliver the policies which you wanted. And if you think about Thatcher and Blair again, Thatcher's big signature policies of defeating the trade unions, of introducing massive privatisation, those are the things which are her legacy when it comes to demonstrating that she had considerably more power than lots of prime ministers before her. And the two about popularity and respect obviously go along with that, because if you manage to achieve those things, then it's likely that you've achieved the respect of the party as well. One of the reasons why this is useful, this personal and political thing, is because some prime ministers have these things, but then lose them. And when we think about Blair and Thatcher, for example, you can, in a very simple sort of, if you were writing about this in an essay, you would say, well, there are weak prime ministers like Major, and there are strong prime ministers like Blair and Thatcher. But actually, one of the things we see is that prime ministers lose their personal and political resources often through the course of the time that they're in office. So if we think about Thatcher, Thatcher had considerable leadership ability and she had a reputation. But by the time we get down to the 1990s, even with success in office and even with having a big majority, when she delivers the poll tax damages her own reputation, damages her own ability to lead her own party. It loses her respect of the population and of her own party itself, to the extent in which it looks as though, were she to go into an election, she'd lose that election, and lots of Conservatives get really nervous about the fact that she would still be the leader. That's why they decide to challenge her. Her own cabinet decides to tell her fatefully that it's time for her to resign, and she's pushed out of the door. So this thing about predominance is not a permanent characteristic, even though we tend to think about in history of Thatcher and Blair as being predominant prime ministers, are very strong compared to the other ones. They actually became weaker towards the end of their prime ministerships, and it's worth us thinking about the fact that prime ministers needn't be either strong or weak. They can be both of those things, and most likely they start by being strong and then become weak. Okay. So whatever the question is that we're asked about prime ministers, the one I'm going to set for us this week, for us to plan and then to write next week, is just going to be this, about the extent to which prime ministers can dominate the political system. There are some other questions that we can think about here, which should be incorporated into a sophisticated response to this. And this is really just, it goes beyond an essay. It's about thinking about why prime ministers are important in themselves. So this first one, for example, these thinking questions, kind of analytical AO2, AO3 type stuff. Does the manner in which a prime minister gets the job determine how powerful they will be? If you think about the post-war period, the number of prime ministers who were leaders of the opposition, who then became prime minister, is not actually that great. So if you think about Thatcher and Wilson and Blair, and then beyond that, we're often thinking about people who were already in their party was already in government. Their own leader had become so weak that they had to be got rid of, and then they were elected in their place. So Brown and May and Major are really good examples of people who came into the job without winning a general election, who came into the job because their own previous predecessor had already been weakened, which means the party had already been weakened, and therefore inherited something which was really difficult for them to contend with, really difficult for them to turn around and then make themselves into strong prime ministers. The exception here, of course, might be Boris Johnson, but we're yet to see about that. Some prime ministers become weaker over time, and we might think about the arc of being a prime minister. How long can you carry on for? Thatcher said she would go on and on and on, and of course even Sheila only lasted 10 years. So we might think about the circumstances which lead a prime minister to lose some of those personal and political resources, which we talked about just in the last slide. And we might think about this one, about why there's been a decline in power. We no longer talk about presidential prime ministers, really. Even with the current government having a big majority, it's unlikely people are going to talk about Boris Johnson, maybe especially right now, as being a presidential type of prime minister. And that might be because there are some things about the institution of British politics which has changed, which have prevented prime ministers from being presidential. So, for example, devolution means that prime ministers have much less control over the UK. Further globalisation and perhaps EU integration up to now also meant that prime ministers have much less control over UK policy. So if we add into that the fact that devolution has created a multi-party system, which in itself has often made it difficult for parties to win big majorities and command the legislative agenda, those things have made Parliament more powerful. And that's one of the things which has made prime ministers in general, no matter who they are, much less powerful than previously. That might be the reason why we talk about Blair as the last presidential type or the last dominant type of prime minister, because he was the one who introduced constitutional reform such as devolution, which meant that all other prime ministers might be less strong, less powerful than him. And this last one is really about, it's not either political resources or institutional resources. If you want a sophisticated AO2 answer, what you need to do is to show that political resources are the things which allow prime ministers to make better use of their preeminence, better use of the fact that they've got institutional resources. Okay, so there's a little recap on different ways of thinking about prime minister's power. I think it kind of takes in most of the things that we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. Of course, what you'd need to do is then support this with some examples of, in particular, of Thatcher and Major, because there are kind of key case studies, but of other recent prime ministers as well. And in the next week or so, I'll give you a couple of tests or quizzes on this, and then we'll think about how we plan an answer to a proper 30-mark question, and then we'll give you a chance to test what you think you know and understand about prime minister's power. Okay, that is your recap on prime minister's power. Look forward to seeing you again soon.